Hi, I'm Jerry Rothhauser, and I'm your tourist guide for reading through the Bible for the year, and I hope you'll keep up. And I'm going to do this every week. It's weekly, a weekly podcast. And if you follow the readings in the one-year Bible, then you'll be keeping up with me. I'll be keeping up with you, and we'll be on the same pages. In fact, those pages are going to be in Genesis, and I'll tell you exactly where we're going to be. Genesis 31, about midway through there, verse 17, all the way through chapter 43. And then, in the New Testament, it will be Matthew 10:24 through few verses into 14, verse 12. And then you're going to cover Psalm 13 all the way through 18, midway through, and then you'll read Proverbs 3:16 through 4:10. So there's several reading plans that follow about the same thing. They follow something out of the Old Testament, something out of the New Testament, some Psalms and some Proverbs, and that's the way we're going to tackle it. And I hope that you will keep up during the year, because if you've already started on January 1st, that's great. In the second week, maybe you did pretty well, maybe you missed a day or two, and now we're getting into the third week, and I hope you're not going to miss any, but maybe you will. And if you do, there's nothing wrong with that. If you do, that's just fine. Just keep up. Follow your reading plan. And if you miss one, you miss one, because you could do it again next year. And then you'll pick it up next year. So it's not a big deal. And I'm helping you along the way anyway. And I spent thousands of dollars, although they told me it was discounted, but seemed like a fair chunk of change to go to school to learn things like this from G.K. Chesterton. Now, my professor acted like he had come up with this himself, but I found out later it was G.K. Chesterton that said this. Now, you may have heard the saying, anything that's worth doing is worth doing well. Have you ever heard of that? Well, Chesterton put a spin on that, and he said that anything that's worth doing well is worth doing poorly. That doesn't sound right, does it? Well, think about it. Because if you're reading through the Bible, that's worth doing, right? It's worth doing well, but also, if you don't do that good of a job on it, you're still learning a ton. And you're ahead of most Christians in their Christian lives if you keep at it. There's a good friend of mine that used to manage 3 radio stations. 3. And here's what he told me. Anything that's worth doing well is messy. He's right. Anything that you endeavor in life and you try to do it, you try to do a good job, and it's important, it's a mess. So he's right on that. Now here's what we've already covered is creation all the way through to Abraham. And one way to break out the book of Genesis is to look at the generations. I'm going to sort that through with you quickly. There's 10 markings in the book of Genesis where there's 10 generations. First of all, there's the generations of the heavens and the earth. Then you have Adam, then Noah, the generations of sons of Noah, So now we've covered already Genesis 1 through 2 with the heavens and earth, 2 to 6 of Adam, and 6 to 9 Noah. And then the generations of the sons of Noah is 10, almost to 12, but 11. And then the sons of Shem, which they're singled out. Now, when you got that far, which was probably in your first week, those first 11 chapters take up 2,000 years. So the whole rest of the Old Testament take up about 2,000 years. So in 11 chapters, you've covered 2,000 years. Then there's the generations of Terah. I didn't know his name that well. I figured, that he was a terror, that he was going to terrorize me. But actually, here's who he is, the father of Abraham. And then on out through the rest of the book of Genesis, 39 chapters. So you covered 11. Then the last 39 is all about Abraham, all about the Jews. So that's important stuff. From chapter 25, you've got the story of Ismael, then more about that family, Isaac, and then in 36, 37 is Esau, you've heard of him, and then 37 to 50 is Jacob. Now here's what I want to talk about for a while. I call it dysfunction at the junction. What do I mean by that? I mean that the family of Abraham, where the patriarchs come from, if you've ever heard of that term, that's the 12 sons of Abraham, the Jews. Now, remember, creation was the very beginning of the book of Genesis, and then we had Adam, and then we had the fall, so we had 4 dispensations covered during that period of time. And what's a dispensation? It marks a relation change between God and humanity. Now, if you want to be saved and go to heaven, that's the same all throughout after the fall. It's by faith in what God was doing, and what he's doing is always pointing at Christ. So Christ is always the basis of salvation. All right, so before and Adam, there's a change in the relationship. That's pretty obvious, right? And then everyone kind of messed everything up. Right at the beginning, after the fall, you had murder with Cain and Abel, and you have people of faith and people who are of unfaith, you might say, and they war with each other all throughout time, even now. So if people are giving you a hard time and you love God, you're trying to do what he wants you to do, people are giving you a hard time. I can guarantee it. So Cain and Abel. And then what God had to do was wipe everyone out. So there was a change between the period before Noah and after Noah. And then there was a big change after that, after the flood. And then you have Abraham. So 4 changes in the relationship between God and man. Then you have 10 that are associated with people. These are all families, by the way, except for heavens and earth, but that's our home base for humanity. You had Adam, Noah, Shem, Terah, Ismael, Isaac, Esau, Jacob, all of them, and we're going to hear a lot about Joseph too. So that's how God has mapped out the book of Genesis for us, and we see sin entering into, it chokes me up. I start stammering. Sin enters into the world, obviously, at the fall, and there's a lot of people that don't believe in sin. And I was just watching a a TV program with a lot of music, and they brought out a bunch of old rock stars, and I couldn't hardly recognize them. One was, in her day, a gorgeous woman, and when she first came out on stage, I thought it was a guy, an old guy. She had white hair, and she was, well, I hope she's not listening. She was ugly. Anyway, that's sin. Sin affects everyone. It ends up in death. That may seem strange to some of us that are the same age, and I can remember people who were just beautiful in movies, and now some of them have even passed on, but they don't look the same, usually. Or anyway, we've got those big happenings in the first 2,000 years, the creation, the fall, Noah and the flood, the Tower of Babel. We've already talked about that. And then, of course, we've got Abraham and his family. And that's why I call it dysfunction at the junction. The junction at Abraham, you can really see how dysfunctional this family is of patriarchs, these famous mentors for an entire religion, and we read all about them, and we may think they're stars, but actually what they are is sinful human beings. Let me give you a few examples, and you're going to read about it. And some of these are just sensational stories. There's Dinah in chapter 34. Of course, you know that Jacob had more than one wife. Abraham had one wife, but he turned her over to heads of state. On more than one occasion, he did that. You talk about dysfunctional. And then you have Isaac, his son. He was married to Rebekah, and he took on a second wife, basically. Important things that you may want to look for along the way. Look for the phrase angel of the Lord, because when you find that, I think that was Jesus in the Old Testament. So you might want to be aware of that. And then there's a man who wrestled with Jacob. You're going to read about that. And I think that man was Christ. Back to Isaac and Rebekah. You had a problem with Rebekah and Laban. Laban was Rebekah's brother. Now, you pretty much need a scorecard to figure out what's going on with this family. But here's the most important thing. They're all sinful, and they're all doing some pretty strange things. The exception is possibly Joseph when we get to him. All right, so at this point, we've got Abraham. Abraham did it and his wife twice, but God rescued both of them. You can read about that. And then Hagar was given to Abraham by Sarah as a concubine because they basically didn't trust God, the patriarchs here, Abraham. None of them did. Isaac, Jacob, they all kind of messed up, and that's called sin. And God worked with them. Isn't that amazing? But he did. All right, so Hagar had a son by Abraham, and you can see how polygamy doesn't work very well as you're reading the Bible. You'll just find it just doesn't work well. And then remember that Isaac and Abraham committed the same sin in turning their wives over to heads of state. And because they're dysfunctional and they're sinful, the same sins. Now, you may think that's not true. It's true. And you may think you're in a family that's not dysfunctional, but you are. In fact, what I found is that some of the families that don't think they're dysfunctional are, guess what? The most dysfunctional, right? And Abraham's family was no exception. In fact, they were prototypes of dysfunction. So Isaac and Rebekah had 2 sons, Ishmael and, we've got the scorecard now. You got Abraham with Sarah, but also Hagar. But then you have Isaac, whose half-brother is Ishmael. And that causes a mess because Ishmael is the father of all the Arab countries, today even. And Isaac was married to Rebekah. Rebekah had a brother named Laban. So when Isaac was looking for a wife for his son Jacob, he sent his servant out, and the servant actually is one of the best men of faith that we've come across so far. There was Noah, and then there's Jacob, who had a servant that was going out and finding a wife for him. Anyway, it was Laban's daughter. I know that means that Jacob married her cousin. So you heard of kissing cousins, but back then it was okay. The law hadn't been enacted yet by Moses, and sin hadn't permeated the human race to the extent that it had later, so that was okay. Jacob was married to his cousin, Rachel, and then Jacob, as you know, Esau and Jacob ran into problems as brothers. You talk about sibling rivalry, but my goodness, Esau was the father of present-day Muslims. And it goes back, that kind of strife goes back all the way back to then. All right, then Jacob had 12 sons and 1 daughter. So 6 of his sons were through Leah because he didn't believe God either. Abraham didn't believe God. Isaac did halfway decently, but Jacob had 6 sons through his concubine, or actually his wife, Leah, because his uncle, Laban, was cheating him. You're going to find a lot of conniving and a lot of deceit, lying in this group, this family. And I'm sure they weren't different than other families of their time, but there was plenty of this in that family. So, through Leah, the patriarchs, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. And then they had a daughter, Dinah. So that was all through Leah. Then, to complicate things even further, Leah gave her maid to Jacob, and that was Zilpah. And that yielded a couple of guys, Gad and Asher. And if you're getting confused, don't feel bad. It's confusing. Then you have Bilhah, who is the maid of Rachel, and they yielded Dan and Naphtali. And then there was Joseph and Benjamin, and Joseph had a couple of kids, Manasseh and Ephraim. So you might think, oh, okay, well, no problem. 12 guys, 12 tribes, 12 patriarchs. No, because then Joseph figures into that with his 2 sons, and he kind of drops out at one point in the allotment of land in the Promised Land. And so you have Manasseh and Ephraim. And have you ever heard someone named Ephraim before? Well, if you're my age, yeah, then you know the Untouchables TV program in the 60s, and Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. That's his name, Ephraim. And he does the narration on a Christian network, actually. All right, anyway, let me give you a couple examples of how dysfunctional this family was. There's the story of Dinah in chapter 34. So 12 guys, and then you add to that with Joseph. I'm not even going to get into that. When you get into the book of Revelation, you've got 12 tribes mentioned, and it gets really complicated around Dan and Manasseh and Ephraim. And Judah heads up the list, even though Reuben was the firstborn. And Dan drops out. And then in Ezekiel, Dan heads the list. And what it has to do with punishment by God in their immorality. So here's an example, Dinah. So Dinah was in that county, she was the finest. Okay, tried to make a joke and it didn't work. Dinah was fina. There you go. And there were some neighborhood guys that one in particular really liked her. Only he didn't go through the courtship procedure. He just raped her. And of course that enraged her brothers, specifically and more intensely her brothers, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. I was thinking of Led Zeppelin. Anyway, here's what happened. They apologized, and so the guy said, well, okay, but we have a tradition. It's circumcision. And if you know what circumcision is, it's like okay for like babies because they'll forget a lot about it when they get older. But when you incorporate that rite later in life, that can be very painful, to say the least. Guys are cringing as they're listening to the podcast. Anyway, so the guy said to this other family outside of Abraham's lineage, well, you have to get circumcised and then everything will be okay. And they said, oh, okay, well, we'll do that. So while they were still sore, guess what? The guys attacked them and killed them. Now, you talk about treachery. Also, here's another story. You have Judah in chapter 38. Dinah, that story is in 34 Genesis. 38 is Judah. And Judah is the namesake of the tribe that Jesus came from and David came from. Judah. So here's what happened with him. He had 3 sons. And the first son, his wife, was his wife, but the husband was an abuser. He was a problem guy. So much so that God just took him. He was there and then he died. Well, then Judah had a second son. And by law, that son was supposed to marry that wife. And guess what happened to him? Well, then he died. So Judah had a third son, and he wouldn't allow, Tamar was her name, wouldn't allow Tamar to marry him. That goes against the law. So Tamar didn't have a husband. So here's what she did. You have to give her some credit. This was pretty creative. She went out to the town square and played the the lady of the evening, if you get my meaning. And she was wearing some kind of hat wear, and a veil of some sort, and disguised herself. So Judah was going out to satisfy himself and picked up this, what he thought was the lady of the evening. Well, he didn't have the means to pay, like a goat or something like that. He didn't have it on him. And so he gave the gal his license and a credit card. No, he didn't. He just gave a signet ring and his cane. So it was like a license and a credit card. So later on, he sent out a servant with a goat, and there was no one there. And Tamar got in the family way. She was pregnant by Judah. You're seeing the dysfunction in this family, right? So Judah wanted to have her killed for playing the prostitute. You talk about hypocrisy there. And so Tamar presented the license and his credit card. Well, his signet ring and his cane. Boy, did he have egg on his face. And he said, yeah, then he admits he made a mistake. So that's chapter 38, if you can believe that. And then 34, that I already told you about, Dinah. If you back it up to show the unfaith in this family, is way back is Rachel wanted some mandrakes from Leah, and she was willing to trade the services of Jacob for a period of time for mandrakes. What were mandrakes? Well, it was basically a superstition. They thought that this one particular vegetable was going to help, like I guess we might say, as popular ED medications these days. But it was a bunch of bunk, but they believed it. And that's the way Rachel was. Then when Jacob got cheated by his uncle Laban, he thought that he could put his animals by striped branches and make a deal for himself that he had with Laban. And it worked, I think, because Jacob's faith. But genetically, if you get into genetic science, striped branches aren't going to help you when you're breeding goats. At any rate, there was Judah. You can see how he was. The Dan later on was a symbol of immorality. Manasseh wasn't willing to go where he's supposed to go in the promised land. Ephraim was known for immorality, the tribe was, and Reuben was jealous of his brother Joseph, who got this really nice robe. And when you get to Joseph, note his haberdashery, his sartorial splendor. Reuben is jealous of Joseph, probably because it's a dysfunctional family. Jacob favored Joseph over the other brothers, mainly, possibly, and probably because Rachel was the mother, and he favored Rachel over Leah. Anyway, Reuben said, let's get rid of Joseph. Let's have him killed. And then Judah, he was the nice guy. He said, no, let's just sell him to some peddlers coming through the area. So that was really nice of Judah, wasn't it? He was the hero in that respect, because they were going to kill Joseph, put him in a hole, and in fact they lied about it. they did sell them to peddlers who were traveling through and took Joseph out of town, and they brought his beautiful coat to his father and put animal's blood on it, get the symbolism of that, to tell his father that he had been killed by an animal. But, in fact, he ended up in Egypt, which was a good thing for all the Jews, as we're going to find out. They were undergoing a famine, and Joseph ended up elevated to second in charge of Egypt and came up with an idea to hoard or store, not hoard, store some grain, and Jacob and all his kids ended up getting some food from Joseph. An amazing story, but an amazing story of dysfunction and sin in a family. And quickly, I'm going to tell you my idea of how God uses marriage. It's to put two people together that need their rough edges to be rubbed off. And in fact, there's a scripture about that in Proverbs that says iron sharpens iron and one person sharpens another. That's in Proverbs 27, verse 17. And what God does, he puts two sinful people together, and then this is true of the entire family of Abraham. He put them together so that they would make them more godly. I can imagine, only imagine, what may have been going on behind closed doors with Abraham and Sarah, or with Rebekah and Isaac, or Rachel and Jacob behind closed doors. My daughter witnessed an instance of domestic abuse a few doors away, out in the open, out in front of the house in the freezing cold. But I'm sure there was a lot of stuff going on behind closed doors, as there is in many families. Here's a book called Sacred Marriage by Gary Thomas. I haven't read it. It was worth the price of the book for me for the subtitle. Here's the subtitle: What if God designed marriage to make us holy more than to make us happy? Is that great? That's worth the price of the book. Of course, I just gave it to you. Was the subtitle. God uses iron against iron, two people, to rub against each other. And I actually believe we're like, you remember My Favorite Martian and Uncle Martin? And he had antenna would go up. I think that's what we do. We have like antenna go up, and that's how we pick. Who we pick to be our spouse is someone that God chooses for us. And we pick because we know that there's unfinished business in our families, and we can continue with that with our spouse. I think that's God's plan. All right, so moving through quickly the travelogue in Genesis 31:17 to 43 through 34 was the deceiver, Jacob. That's what his name means. Great name for Jake. Okay, he's a deceiver. That's what it means. He was being tricked by Laban. Then you're going to find out how Laban's daughter, Jacob's wife, ends up tricking Laban. And that's an interesting story, but you can read it. Esau and Jacob were fighting each other and ended up being reconciled. And then Dinah, the story I already told you in chapter 34, and how her brother took up for her. Jacob returned to Bethel, and God renewed the covenant with Jacob, who was, of course, grandson of Abraham, and God made a promise to him. Rachel died when Benjamin was born, so Rachel really only had 2 sons, who plays prominently in the whole story of Abraham and the Jews. And then there's Joseph, and that whole story of Joseph throughout the end of Genesis there, up through chapter 50. So it'll not be next week's reading, but it'll continue into the week after that. Joseph, there's coats in his story that run like a thread through what's going on with him and God. The first was his father gave him a special coat, which made his brothers even more jealous. And Joseph had dreams and made the mistake, I think arrogantly, how God was going to bless him. So they didn't like that. They tried to kill him, and God protected him. Joseph interpreted dreams, and later, after he was in prison, and then accused of immorality, again, people of unfaith attacking of people of faith. So Joseph ended up in the household of Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife, Joseph must have been quite a hunk, and so she tried to have her way with him and ended up just with her coat. So there's the coat thing again. He ended up in prison and interpreted dreams for a butler and a baker. Now, I don't know how the candlestick maker got left out of the equation, but he did. So I should be able to easily remember that it was the butler who ended up pretty good in the whole story, because the baker got offed, but the butler survived. He was supposed to tell the Pharaoh that Joseph deserved to get out of prison, but he forgot for a couple of years. Then he remembered, and then Joseph ended up interpreting a dream for the Pharaoh and ended up to be his right-hand person. Meanwhile, back on the ranch, Jacob and the boys were starving because there was a famine. And they didn't know that it was Joseph in Egypt that was controlling all of the food for all that portion of the world. So Jacob sent his remaining 10 sons to Egypt. He didn't want Benjamin to go because he was afraid that he could lose him. So they went out, and there were shenanigans there between Joseph and the brothers, and I'll let you read about that, and I'll pick up with it next week. So, the New Testament. In the New Testament, you could read from Matthew 10:24 to 14:12. There's going to be principles of morality that Jesus explains in chapter 10. And then Jesus rejected some of the cities that he were in because they rejected him. And in fact, Jesus made a statement that it's going to be more favorable for Sodom and Gomorrah and some immoral cities than it would be on the day of judgment for some of the cities he was visiting. Now, here's what that indicates. That hell is not just hell. There's degrees of punishment in hell. Just like, just like Dante said it would be. I had an uncle named Uncle Dante. And Dante was right. There's degrees of punishment in hell. Because if it's worse for certain individuals, then for others, there's degrees of punishment. Jesus made a final break with the religious leaders in chapter 12, but also in chapter 12 is an interesting thing, the unpardonable sin. You ever heard of that? Did you ever think that you had committed the unpardonable sin? Well, you didn't. The only way you could commit the unpardonable sin was to live in Jesus' time, to see Jesus, to ignore that he's God, and reject him. That's the unpardonable sin. It's always the unpardonable sin, really, in one sense, all throughout the eras, all through the years. If you reject Christ, you don't go to heaven. If you trust Christ, you'll go to heaven. So the unpardonable sin was blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. In other words, seeing the miracles that Jesus had done, the healings and changing water into wine in the book of John, all those things he had done, that if you saw that and rejected those things and didn't believe in him, then you don't end up in heaven. Then there's parables about how the kingdom of heaven would grow, which occurs during the church age. And then John the Baptist was murdered, and his head was served up on a platter. Again, people of unfaith attacking people of faith. Let's rip through Psalms quickly. You're going to read Psalm 13. 13 is interesting. Verse 1, how long, O Lord, wilt thou forget me forever? That's verse 1. You may feel that way, that God feels that way about you, that he's forgotten about you, but he hasn't. Chapter 14 of Psalms, also known as Psalm 14, which is what we normally call it, but that's the 14th chapter. They have all gone astray, they have all become corrupt, and there is none that does good, no, not one. Does that sound familiar to you? Well, it's in Romans 3. That's the basic idea that we're sinful human beings, as you could see with Abraham and his progeny. Verse 23 in Romans sums it up. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Chapter 15 is kind of neat because it talks about what happens to people who are moral and upright. You may want to check that out. And chapter 16, Psalm 16, I keep the Lord always before me because he is at my right hand. I shall not be moved. That's a great verse, isn't it? Verse 8, Psalm 16. And then verse 11, the last one, is memorizable. I like to point those out to you. You will show me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. In your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Isn't that a great verse? Chapter 17. Why do I keep calling it a chapter? It's Psalm 17, verse 8. Keep me as the apple of your eye. God thought of David as someone as the apple of his eye, and he will you too, if you have a heart for the Lord. Chapter 18, you're going to, Psalm 18, you're going to break in two. So you'll find out that God is the rock in verse 2. Christ the solid rock is my favorite hymn. In verses 4 and 5 are echoes of Jonah. The cords of death encompassed me. The torrents of perdition assailed me. The cords of Sheol entangled me. The snares of death confronted me. Reminds me of Jonah being in the whale, and he was having to wrestle seaweed when he was in there. verse 24 says, with the pure you will show yourself pure, and with the crooked you will show yourself perverse. That explains why a lot of people who don't have faith and they act corruptly and they do crazy, nutty things, or even Christians who do that, and people of faith, but mostly people who don't exhibit faith, they don't see God as good. They may not see him as someone who exists, but they don't see him as good. Believers do. And a cross-reference, Titus chapter 1, verse 15, says kind of the same thing. Now here's a great verse when you need strength and help. It sounds like Superman out of this verse. And here's the Revised Standard. Yea, by thee I can crush a troop, and by my God I can leap over a wall. No wonder why there's a yea at the beginning of that. Yay! We can be strong and leap, a skyscraper, or run over the top of a locomotive. All right, I think that's what that verse says. When you have God, that's how strong you are. Now, I went quickly through Proverbs 3:16 to 4:10, and what I would suggest you do is, from last week's reading, memorize verses 9 and 10 of Proverbs 3, although you should already have memorized verses 5 and 6 of Proverbs 3, so you can check that out. All right, there we are, the readings for the week from the One Year Bible. And here's a riddle. Here's for something you to solve this next week. Noah was 600 years old when the flood occurred. Methusaleh, you ever heard of Methusaleh? He was the oldest living man ever. 969 years old. 969. Now here is the shocking thing. He maybe could have lived longer than that. Because Methuselah, when he was 187 years old, you talk about spry, he had a son. The son was Lamech. Lamech was 182 years old when Noah was born. So that's a total of 369 years. And you add 600 to that, and what do you get? 969. Coincidentally, or not, how long Methuselah lived. So he's right on our theme for today, dysfunction. Most likely, it wasn't just coincidence that he lived to be 969. He could have been wiped out from the flood. He was one of the people that were judged in the flood, just like everyone else other than Noah and his family. So you can see how amazing it is that God continued to work with Abraham. He promised that he would, but he worked with his family, his dysfunctional family. And here's a couple of verses that are appropriate, I think. Look up Isaiah 43:25. It says that God is going to remove our sins from us, and he won't forget them. And that's repeated in Hebrews 10, verse 17, Hebrews 8, verse 12. It's also in Jeremiah 31:34. Isn't that comforting to you? God's not going to remember your sin. And an old pastor friend told me about, in Psalm 56:9, it says, God is for us. See you next week.